could do this for a lot more time. And I'm sorry that we don't have time to do so. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to get a sense of how you found your stories, the characteristics that you had in common in your stories. Now, had we had another half hour, I would have done this in a more formal way. You would have each appointed a personal storyteller in each group. You would have reported back and so on. But we don't have that time, unfortunately, so let's do what we can with the time we have. So what I'd like you to do is to just anybody who can pull together a couple of words of what was in common in your group's stories. Just put up your hand, please. Thank you. And I'm going to just write down some of the key words. Okay, so reframe. Okay. So it was external influence and reframe. Okay. Anybody else, please? Thank you. Yes. Immediate change. Okay.
Inner power as well. Inner power.
Inner power. Okay. Surprise. Surprise. Okay. Anything else? Wait, if you just raise your hand, I'd like to see who's yes, go ahead.
New eyes.
New eyes. Okay. New eyes. Okay. Anything else? Wait, just raise your hand for a moment. Yes, sir.
Realization and impact.
Realization and impact. And you, sir?
Possibilities.
Possibilities. I think I heard someone else over here say possibilities. Anything else? Yes. Change of emotions. Okay, I'm hearing similar words, right? Change, possibility, impact. Okay, anything else? Yes. Attention. Okay, attention. Is there anybody for whom your stories did not reflect any of these at all? Okay. So here's what happens. Had we had a room where each of you got into a group of, let's say, 6 people, and you shared your stories at length, you took 15 minutes or 20 minutes to share each story, and then in a more formal way, you would have come up with a list of common characteristics of your story. This is what would have happened. I would have written down an exhaustive list from the first group. The second group, I would have added a couple of words and then done a couple of ticks. And then the third group, I would have added one word and then ticked a few more. Now it's interesting, when I do this with companies of software engineers and senior managers, usually we have a list of about 10. When I did this at the ICF conference in Texas, we had a list of about 50. Such are coaches, very able to express themselves. But the same principle applies. And what does it mean? What it means is that stories are universal. This creates, as it were, the recipe for the ultimate coaching experience. And it's the same for everybody. So if I want to create the ultimate coaching experience, I just follow this. It needs to reframe. It needs to have external influence. There needs to be change. It needs to involve inner power. There should be surprise. There should be new eyes. These are all very familiar if you think about it, but it's a universal state. Now, I asked each of you to tell an intensely personal experience. I didn't say, tell about a general feeling. I said, tell a personal experience. And I said, make it specific. So what we're hearing is that the specific story touches on universal truth. And that's why stories work. Because when you tell a specific story, people connect to it, they relate to it, and it's incredibly powerful. So, before I finish my final story, I'd like to invite you to do 3 things. The first thing is to really think about how are your stories serving you. I'd like to invite you to think about the challenges and the struggles that you've faced and how you have transformed them into some type of learning or empowerment and how you could possibly tell that. And finally, I would like to invite you to figure out the places in your life and in your work, where you could really do with more powerful stories and start to figure out how to create them. You know, I've been teaching story coaching for a couple of years now. The Certified Story Coach program is actually accredited by the ICF. And what I find, which is amazing about it, is that it's very instinctive to people. You know, people are using stories already. And what the program does, and this is not about the program, this is about the methodology or about the vision, is that it really just helps people focus in on something that's so instinctive already. I mean, we're all doing it. It's incredibly powerful, and people love to hear it. And it's very simple. It's very, very simple. So I really thank you for the honor of being here today. It's really been wonderful for me. And I'd like to leave you with a story. There was once a farmer and a shepherd who lived and worked side by side. They were great, great friends. The farmer's land was very rich and he thrived, but the shepherd's land was not the same, and he struggled. And year after year, his flock became smaller, his family became thinner, he became poorer, until finally he realized he could no longer stay there, he would need to leave and find better land. So he went to his friend the farmer and he said, I have to go now, we must leave, we cannot survive here. And the farmer said, you can't leave, we're the best of friends, I can't lose a neighbor like you. And the shepherd said, well, what can I do? The farmer said, I have more land than I need, take half of mine. The shepherd said, I can't possibly accept a gift like that, it's far too great. But the farmer said, put out your hand. He lifted a stone from the ground, he placed it in the shepherd's hand, and he placed his hand on top. He said to him, who is more strong, the giver or the receiver? The shepherd didn't know how to answer, but the farmer said, the receiver is stronger because he bears the weight of the gift and the giver. Accept my gift. And so he did, and they continued to live side by side, and they both thrived. And some years later, the shepherd was digging in the land that the farmer had given him, and he came across something hard. And he dug a little bit more, and he found a chest of gold. And he immediately dug out the gold, put it in a bag, and ran to the farmer and said, you're rich, I found gold on your land. And the farmer said, you're rich, it's your land, and it's your gold. And then for the first time, in all the years of their friendship, they argued. And they couldn't resolve it. So finally, they decided to go to the wise man of the village to get his advice. And they went there, they took the sack of gold, and they went in and they explained what happened, that they'd shared the land, and that he had found it on the farmer's land, which was the shepherd's land, and what were they going to do. And the wise man said, well, I have here 3 disciples. I suggest you listen to each of their suggestions, and then you choose one of them. And they agreed. The first of the wise man's disciples said, the gold is what's causing all the trouble. Bring it back to the field, put it in the ground, and bury it, and then everything will be resolved. And they listened. The second disciple said, at the end of the day, all this land belongs to the Sultan. You should bring it to him as a gift. And the third disciple, who was a young woman, said, you should take this money, and you should create a beautiful garden, and you should donate it to the poor, because the poor need it more than anybody, and it should belong to them. And immediately the farmer and the shepherd agreed that that's what they would do. But the wise man said, if this is indeed what you do, then this young woman, my disciple, shall take the gold to the market, shall buy the seeds, and shall be responsible for creating this beautiful garden. And it was agreed by everybody. And then the wise man turned to the disciple and said to her, take those seeds, take this gold, buy the seeds, plant the garden, but never ever forget that wherever you stand, you hold up the sky. She didn't really understand what that meant, but she took the gold and she went to the market, and she went through the clothing area and the cloth and the fruit and the meat and everything else, until finally she got to a smaller alley, and there was a big store where they sold seeds. And she went in and she began choosing seeds for all kinds of trees and plants, and she was beginning to gather them up. She had the gold in her hand, and then she heard the most terrible sound, heartbreaking sound. She went back out onto the road and she looked up and she saw coming towards her a camel being led by a man, and on the sides of the camel, on the flanks, were hung many, many birds, all hung by their feet, all different colours and sizes and shapes. And the terrible sound was the sound of those birds screeching, the sound of those birds dying. She said to the man driving the camel, "Where are you going with the birds?" And the man said, "Oh, these are the most wonderful birds. I've collected some of the very last of their species. They're beautiful, they're wonderful." "And where are you taking them?" she asked. He said, "I'm taking them to the Sultan, and to get a grand payment for this. I've been collecting them for many, many weeks and months." And she said, "I will buy those birds." She had no doubt. "I will buy those birds." He said, "You don't have that kind of money." She said, "Yes, I do." And she took the bag of gold and opened it up in front of him, and it was indeed enough. She said, "Let go of the birds, free them." And slowly he let each one of them go. Some of them were so sick they had to be lifted up, and their wings had to be straightened, and they had to be let loose. Some of them flew away immediately. And there was one tiny blue bird that was very poorly. It looked like it was going to die. She held it in her hands, gently blew the bird, and it flew up and circled and disappeared. And in that moment, she was truly happy. And then she remembered the gold and the seeds. She had no seeds and she had no gold, and she had promised that she was going to build a garden for the poor. What was she going to do? She went back to the field where they had found the gold, and she sat down on a rock and she began to cry. And as she cried, she said to herself, "I have no gold, and I have no seeds, and the garden for the poor, and they trusted me." And as a tear dropped down from her face and touched the ground, a little blue bird appeared. And it flew around above her, and it flew away. And then it came back with many, many birds. And they all held little seeds in their beaks, and they dug to the ground, and they planted those seeds, and they flew off to the mountains, and they brought water in their beaks, and they created a river, and magically this amazing garden appeared. It was the most beautiful garden anybody could imagine, and it was exactly as she had seen it in her mind. Now when the rich heard about this garden, they came running, but they were greeted at the gates of the garden with squawking and squeaking and birds that wouldn't let them in. But when the poor heard about the garden, they came to it, and the doors opened, and they heard the trickling of the water, and there was shade under the trees, and there was fruit hanging low that they could pick and eat. And they stayed there, and they rested. And then those of them that had homes to go to, they went home, and those of them that didn't made their home in the garden of the poor. And with this story, I would like to give you 3 blessings. The first blessing is that you will have a friendship like the friendship of the farmer and the shepherd. And the second blessing of the story is that you will always recognize and be able to let free those that need to be freed. And the third blessing is that you never ever forget that where you stand, you hold up the sky.